It was just after 6 in the morning on a Tuesday in late October when Elias Thorne stepped out of his truck at the trailhead and noticed that the birds had gone quiet. Not the gradual silence of a passing hawk. Not the slow taper of dawn giving way to morning. This was immediate, total, the kind of quiet that doesn't settle over a forest. It descends on one. He'd worked these hills for 23 years. He knew the difference. He laced up his boots, checked his radio, and started up the trail. What he would find 3 miles in, carved into the bark of a pine that had been standing since before his grandfather was born, would end his career, alter the course of a cold case that had been sealed for over a century, and leave a question sitting over the Black Hills that no one has yet been able to answer. Before we go any further, let us know in the comments where you're watching from, and don't forget to subscribe so you never miss what comes next. To understand what Elias found, you first have to understand what the Black Hills are, not the postcard version, not the tourism brochure with Mount Rushmore on the cover, the actual hills, the ones that stretch across the western edge of South Dakota into Wyoming, 6,000 square miles of ponderosa pine and granite, limestone cave systems that haven't been fully mapped, drainages that flood every spring and dry to dust by August, and ridge lines at the Lakota called Pahasapa, the heart of everything that is. This is not empty land. It is land with a long memory, and anyone who has spent real time in its backcountry will tell you, without any particular drama, that there are parts of those hills that feel occupied, not by people, by something older than people. Elias Thorne had grown up 40 minutes east of the hills in a small town where half the men either worked the land or worked in it. His father had been a timber surveyor. His uncle had done trail maintenance for the Forest Service for 30 years. For Elias, going into rangering wasn't ambition. It was more like inheritance. He applied at 24, passed his assessments, and spent his first 5 years doing the work that nobody talks about. Checking permits, clearing deadfall, responding to the occasional lost hiker who'd underestimated the elevation change. He was methodical, quiet, not particularly talkative, the kind of man who noticed things without always mentioning them. His supervisor at the time, a woman named Carol Briggs, who'd been with the service for longer than most, said that Elias had what she called good eyes. He saw the land clearly. He didn't project onto it. That Tuesday in October was a routine patrol. Elias had been assigned to check the condition of a restricted drainage in the northwestern quadrant of the district, an area locals called the Crow Peak Corridor, though it didn't appear under that name in any official maps. It was unmarked for a reason. The terrain was unstable in places. The trail had never been formally maintained, and access had been restricted following a series of erosion events in the late 90s. Most of the rangers avoided it, not because there was any particular policy against going in, but because there was no real reason to go in. The drainage didn't connect to any of the main trail systems. There were no developed sites, no permitted campgrounds, no features listed in any visitor guide. It was, for all practical purposes, a forgotten corner of an otherwise well-documented landscape. Elias had been to the corridor a handful of times over the years, always uneventful. He went in that morning expecting nothing different. He brought a water bottle, his field notebook, a camera for documenting erosion, and his radio. He did not bring anything else because there was nothing else he thought he'd need. The first 2 miles were unremarkable. The trail, such as it was, wound through a mid-elevation pine forest, rising gradually toward a rocky spine that separated the drainage from the next valley over. The air was cold. The light was low and gray, filtered through cloud cover that had moved in overnight. He noted a section of trail that had washed out slightly near a creek crossing and photographed it for the maintenance log. He checked a small culvert that had been flagged for inspection. Routine work. The kind of morning where your hands are busy but your mind is somewhere else. Then the bird stopped. He would describe it later, in the written report he submitted before he stopped submitting reports altogether, as a pressure change. Not in the air, in the environment itself. Like something had shifted just outside the range of what his senses could measure. He stood still for a moment and listened. Nothing, not even wind. The pines around him were motionless. He looked up through the canopy. The clouds had thickened. He checked his GPS. He was about 2.5 miles in, approaching a cluster of old-growth ponderosa pines that sat on a small natural bench above the drainage. He'd noticed a cluster on previous trips. 5 trees arranged in a rough semicircle, their trunks wider than he could wrap his arms around, their bark plated and orange red in the morning light. He'd always thought they were the kind of trees that should have a name. He'd never given them one. He came up over the edge of the bench and stopped. The middle tree, the largest of the 5, the one that sat at the apex of the semicircle, had something on it, a carving. Not the initials in a heart, kind of carving that teenagers leave. Not the crude attempts at signatures that you find on trees near popular trails. This was deliberate, geometric, arranged in a pattern that took up roughly 2 feet of the tree's lower trunk, a series of angular marks, cut deep into the bark, organized into what looked like a sequence, not random, not decorative, something that had been put there with intention. Elias photographed it from several angles before he got close enough to touch it. When he did, he noticed something that stopped him cold. The cuts were fresh. Not fresh as in recent season fresh. Fresh as in the wood beneath was still pale, still slightly damp to the touch, the cambium not yet darkened by oxidation. Whoever had made this carving had done so within the last few days, possibly within the last 24 hours. But the bark around the cuts, the plating, the furrows, the texture of a tree that had stood for well over a century, showed no disturbance. No removed plates, no scarring from tools applied to the outer bark. The cuts appeared to go directly through undisturbed old bark into fresh wood beneath, as though the tree had grown around damage that hadn't yet happened. He stood there for a long time, long enough for the clouds to shift and a thin light to come through the canopy. He photographed everything he could think to photograph. He radioed in his location. He wrote the coordinates in his field notebook, and then he drove back to the station and started asking questions. The questions led him to a filing cabinet. Not immediately. First they led him to his supervisor, who led him to the district records office, who led him to a contact at the Forest Service's Historical Archives Division, who eventually pointed him toward a collection of documents that had been transferred to microfiche and then to digital scan without anyone taking particular stock of what they contained. The collection was filed under a general heading for land survey correspondence from the 1920s. It had been cross-referenced once, in 1987, and then left alone. What those documents contained was this. In the summer of 1924, a surveyor named, in the records, only as R. Calloway had been dispatched to the Crow Peak Corridor as part of a broader federal mapping initiative. Calloway was, by the accounts of his contemporaries, an experienced man, 38 years old. He had surveyed territory in Montana and Wyoming before being assigned to South Dakota. He was not, by anyone's description, a man given to imagination or anxiety. His field notes were precise. His maps were clean. His reports to the department were factual to the point of being dry. He went into the corridor in August of 1924 and did not come back. The official record classified the case as a disappearance due to unknown circumstances. The initial search covered 2 weeks and roughly 40 square miles. No remains were found. No equipment was recovered. His pack, his instruments, his bedroll, all of it gone. The case was left open for 3 years before being reclassified as a probable accidental death and filed away. There was no public attention. There was no family in the area. There was no one, it seems, who pushed for answers. But Calloway had left something behind. Before he disappeared, he had mailed a package from a post office in a small town at the eastern edge of the hills. The package arrived at the survey office in Washington 10 days after he was reported missing. Inside were field sketches, detailed charcoal drawings on survey paper, of a cluster of trees in a natural amphitheater above a drainage. 5 trees, drawn from the same angle, with the largest at center. And on the trunk of that tree, rendered in careful detail, was a pattern of angular marks arranged in a sequence. The sketch was labeled, in Calloway's handwriting, with 2 words in what appeared to be a Lakota-derived script that a translator later rendered as something close to "do not return." The geometry of the marks in Calloway's sketch and the geometry of the marks Elias Thorne photographed in October were, according to a structural analysis conducted by a researcher at a regional university who asked not to be identified in this account, identical. Not similar. Identical. There are two ways to sit with that finding. The first is to conclude that someone, at some point in the last century, had found Callaway's sketches, reproduced the marks, and placed them on a tree as a kind of historical recreation or prank. It's a reasonable theory. It has the comfort of explanation. But it runs into a problem almost immediately, which is that the sketches Callaway mailed to Washington were never made public. They sat in the Federal Archive for decades, undigitized, unreferenced in any public-facing record. When the archivist who helped locate them for Elias checked the access log, she found that the last documented review of that physical file had been in 1987, and even then the notation suggested it had been pulled as part of general audit rather than for any specific research purpose. So if someone had copied those marks, they would have needed access to a non-public federal archive. They would have needed to know the file existed. They would have needed to know exactly which drainage in a 6,000 square mile landscape to find the trees. And they would have needed to place the carving on a tree in a way that made it look as though the wound in the bark had been there for decades, despite the wood beneath being freshly cut. The second way to sit with a finding is harder to articulate. It's the way Elias Thorne seemed to be sitting with it, based on what he said in the weeks after his discovery, before he stopped talking about it entirely. He said that the carving didn't feel like it had been placed there. It felt like it had surfaced. In the months following Elias's report, a small number of researchers and local historians began quietly examining the broader area for related incidents. What they found was not a single dramatic revelation. It was a pattern, assembled from separate pieces that no one had thought to connect. Over the previous winter, between November and March, 12 separate reports had been filed with the Forest Service by hikers, hunters, and backcountry campers describing unusual markings on trees throughout the northwestern quadrant of the district. Not all of them were identical to what Elias found, but they shared characteristics. Angular cuts, deep and clean, arrangements that repeated across multiple trees. A consistency of geometry that the Forest Service had initially attributed to natural scarring, the kind of damage that occurs when lightning passes through bark or when freezing water expands inside a surface wound. A forester who reviewed the photographs as part of an independent analysis said, and this is a direct quote from a written communication shared with one of the researchers, that natural scarring does not produce bilateral symmetry. It does not repeat a pattern across separate trees, and it does not, under any documented circumstances, form sequences that a trained observer would describe as writing. When the coordinates of all 12 reports were plotted on a map, they formed a triangle. The 3 points of the triangle were approximately 4 miles apart from each other. The center of the triangle, the geometric middle point, corresponded to a feature that appeared on older USGS survey maps as a limestone cave system that had been noted in the 1960s, explored briefly in the early 1980s, and subsequently listed in agency records as collapsed and inaccessible. 2 of the researchers drove out to that location and found that the entrance was not collapsed. It was blocked. There was a difference. Someone or something had placed rock fill across the opening in a way that would look, from a distance or from a satellite image, like natural rubble. Up close, the placement was deliberate. They did not go in. One of them later said that she had no desire to, and that she was not embarrassed to say so. Here is where the official record becomes thin. After Elias submitted his initial report, the Forest Service opened a low-priority inquiry into the carvings. The inquiry was assigned a case number. An investigator was designated. A timeline was established for a follow-up assessment, and then, over the course of about 6 weeks, the inquiry quietly lost momentum. Emails went unanswered. The investigator was reassigned. A request to have the tree formally documented by the agency's Heritage Resources team was submitted and not acted upon. When one of the researchers following the case submitted a public records request for the inquiry file, the response indicated that a file existed but was not yet available for release under a procedural review provision that carries no mandatory deadline. Elias, for his part, applied for extended leave in November and moved out his rental house near the district office. His forwarding address was not on file. His colleagues said he left without much explanation. One of them, a ranger named Dale who had worked alongside Elias for over a decade, said the last time he saw him, Elias seemed fine, calm, not distressed in any visible way. But he said something that Dale thought was odd at the time. He said he'd gone back to the tree a second time, on his own, after his official report, just to look again. And at the base of the tree, beneath the carved pattern, in the soft ground between two exposed roots, he'd found something scratched into the bark near the ground line. He said it took him a while to recognize it, because he wasn't expecting to see it there. It was his name, not carved in the same geometric sequence as the marks above, written in plain letters. First name only, in handwriting that he described as deliberate and unhurried, as though whoever put it there had all the time in the world. Dale said he didn't know what to make of that. He still doesn't, at this point in the investigation. The people who had been following the case were left with two possibilities. Which one would you have believed? The first was that someone with significant knowledge of federal archives, a detailed understanding of the terrain, and access to restricted land had constructed an elaborate series of markings over the course of a winter to create the impression of something much older, and had, in the process, learned Elias Thorne's name and his patrol route well enough to know exactly which tree he would approach and when. The second was that whatever had been in that drainage in 1924, whatever R. Calloway had encountered in those hills in August of that year, had never left, and had been patient. Neither of those possibilities is comfortable, and the discomfort is compounded by the fact that the trail camera footage doesn't help resolve it. In February, one of the researchers placed a motion-activated trail camera on a tree adjacent to the one bearing the carvings. She set it to photograph at 10-minute intervals and to record video on motion trigger. She retrieved the camera 3 weeks later. The still photographs showed nothing unusual. The motion-triggered video clips, and there were 14 of them, showed, in several instances, shadows moving through the frame at a time when the sun was at an angle that could not have produced those shadows from anything standing in the open. In 2 clips, the movement had a quality that the researcher spent some time trying to describe. She settled on this. It moved the way something moves when it is not concerned about being seen. The footage has been reviewed by 2 people outside the research group. One declined to comment. The other said it was probably a lens artifact from the cold. He did not sound certain when he said it. The question that sits at the center of all of this, the one that the physical evidence in the archival record and the trail camera footage all point toward but cannot answer, is not whether something is present in that drainage. The evidence, such as it is, suggests that something is. The question is what kind of something. And here the range of interpretation is genuinely wide. There are people who have looked at this case and concluded that the simplest explanation is the right one. A person or a group of people, with unusual resources and unusual intent, has been doing something in that corridor for reasons that have nothing to do with the supernatural. Perhaps they know about the Calloway case and are exploiting it. Perhaps the cave system contains something they want kept off the official map. Perhaps Elias Thorne was targeted specifically because he was a ranger with jurisdiction over the area, and the appearance of his name on the tree was a warning of the conventional kind. It's not a comfortable explanation, but it's a human one. There are others who have looked at the same evidence and gone somewhere different. The Lakota relationship to the Black Hills is not a simple one. The land carries a significance that is not metaphorical. It is cosmological, embedded in a worldview that treats the hills as a living system with its own agency. There are specific locations within the hills that are treated as places of encounter, where the boundary between what is ordinary and what is other becomes less fixed. The Crow Peak corridor sits, according to at least one Lakota elder who was contacted by one of the researchers and spoke briefly and carefully, in a part of the hills that has been considered one of those locations for as long as anyone can trace the oral record. The elder did not use the word dangerous. The word he used, as translated, was attentive. What we know, confirmed and documented, is this. An experienced ranger found a carving on an old growth pine that matched the sketches left by a surveyor who disappeared in the same location 102 years earlier. The official inquiry into that carving was opened and then allowed to go quiet. A pattern of similar markings has been documented across a triangular area centered on a cave system that is listed as inaccessible but is not. The ranger who found the original carving left his post and his residence without explanation after reporting that his name appeared at the base of the tree. And the birds, at least on the morning he arrived, had gone completely silent. What we do not know is who made the marks. whether Calloway's disappearance and the current markings are connected by human agency or by something that resists that framing, what is in the cave, or where Elias Thorne is now. If you spend time in the South Dakota backcountry, particularly in the northwestern quadrant of the Black Hills, there are things worth knowing that have nothing to do with fear and everything to do with attention. The Crow Peak corridor is currently under restricted access, but restrictions in that terrain are not always enforced. If you encounter markings on trees that seem deliberate, the advice from the people who have been closest to this case is consistent. Photograph them, note your coordinates, and leave the area. Do not add to them. Do not attempt to replicate them. Do not treat them as an invitation to dig deeper in that moment. Whatever they represent, human or otherwise, they are not decorative. The researchers who have been following this case are still following it. The public records request for the inquiry file has not been fulfilled. The cave entrance remains blocked. The trail camera has been retrieved but not replaced. And the 5 trees on the bench above the drainage are still there, the largest of them bearing marks that no one has yet been able to fully explain. The carvings are appearing more frequently. That much is documented. 12 reports in one winter, in a corridor that historically generated almost no trail traffic and no incident reports. Whether that frequency represents an escalation or simply a wider awareness, more people paying attention to something that was always there, is a question that the evidence cannot answer. What it does suggest is that whatever is operating in those hills, whether it is a person protecting something, a community maintaining a practice, or something that the existing vocabulary for a classification doesn't quite fit, it is not receding. It is not content to be forgotten, and it has, at minimum, enough patience to wait a century between communications. Calloway sent his sketches from a post office at the edge of the hills 10 days before he was reported missing. The researchers have wondered more than once whether the package was a warning or a record, whether he sent it because he was afraid or because he understood that no one would believe him if he came back and tried to explain, whether the marks on the tree were what he found or what found him. There is no way to know. There is no closing document, no final report, no resolved narrative sitting at the end of this. There's only the tree on the bench, the fresh cuts in the old bark, the name written at the base in patient letters, and a question of what it means that the hills chose to write it there. Cases like this don't disappear. They just fade when people stop asking questions. If you've been to the Black Hills backcountry, if you've seen something that didn't quite fit, if you've heard from someone who came back changed, we'd genuinely like to know. Leave it in the comments. Not because this channel will solve what the Forest Service couldn't, but because the record matters. And right now, the record is thin.